The gown arrived on a Wednesday. I know because Wednesdays were the only days Gideon Ferris kept his office door open, a deliberate signal to the 43 people who worked the executive floor of Ferris Group that he was available, approachable, human. By 9 that morning, he'd already reviewed 3 acquisition proposals, declined a meeting with a city councilman whose interests didn't align with his, and taken a call from someone whose name never appeared on any official company roster. I had worked for Gideon for 5 years, long enough to know which phone line to answer and which to let ring. Long enough to understand that the man behind the glass partition, dark-haired, broad-shouldered, with eyes the color of slate in winter, ran 2 versions of the same empire. One was printed on letterhead and filed with the SEC. The other was kept in a different kind of ledger entirely. He'd hired me at 23, fresh out of UMass with a business degree and more confidence than sense. I'd called his personal line instead of going through HR. He'd asked me why. I told him that if I'd gone through HR, I'd have been screened out before he ever saw my name. He hired me that afternoon. 5 years, and in 5 years, I had never once let him see what happened to me when he walked into a room. The gown showed up at 2:30, a courier with a garment box wrapped in matte black packaging, tied with a thin satin ribbon the color of champagne. I signed for it at the front desk and felt something cold settle in my stomach. My engagement gown for the Hartwell Gala. Alistair had chosen it. He'd sent his personal stylist, given her my measurements, written a check to a designer whose name I recognized from the society pages. He hadn't asked what I wanted. He never did, not about the small things, and increasingly not about the large ones either. Personal delivery, Nash? Gideon's voice carried from the open doorway of his office. He was leaning against the frame, jacket off, sleeves rolled to the elbows in that particular way he had when he'd been at his desk for hours and forgotten to notice. The gown for the Hartwell event. I kept my voice even. I apologize for having it sent here. My building's package room has had 3 thefts this quarter. Alistair Pemberton's charity gala. He said it the way he said most things that displeased him, flatly, without inflection, which was somehow worse than if he'd raised his voice. This Saturday. Yes. Something moved behind his eyes, gone before I could read it. Try it on, he said. I blinked. I'm sorry. The gown. He gestured toward the small conference room at the end of the hall, the one with the full-length mirror installed for client presentations. Try it on, make sure it fits. If it needs alterations, you've got a few days. If you wait until Friday night, you won't. It was practical, sensible even, exactly the kind of observation he made about everything. Mr. Ferris. Emery. He used my first name rarely enough that when he did it stopped me cold. Try on the dress. I took the box into the conference room, and I told myself my hands weren't shaking. The gown was beautiful. Floor-length silk charmeuse in deep midnight blue, with a bodice that draped and gathered in a way that required a lot of money and a very good eye to achieve. Alistair's stylist had known what she was doing, even if the whole exercise had felt less like a gift and more like costuming. I changed quickly, reached back for the zipper, and managed it on the 3rd try. Then I looked in the mirror. The woman looking back at me wore the gown like it had been made for her body, which it essentially had been. She looked composed, polished, exactly right for a fundraiser at the Hartwell Hotel, where Alistair Pemberton would stand at a podium and talk about his Senate campaign, while I stood beside him and smiled. She looked like a very well-dressed prop. I stood there longer than I meant to. 5 years of early mornings and late nights in that building. 5 years of work I was genuinely good at, of problems I'd solved before Gideon had finished asking me to solve them. 5 years of building something that mattered. And in 6 months I'd be Mrs. Alistair Pemberton, expected to lunch at the right clubs and say the right things, and absolutely not continue working for a man with Gideon Ferris's particular kind of reputation. Alistair had been clear about that. Kyle had needed him. That was the beginning of all of it. My brother's biotech startup had collapsed 18 months ago. A promising concept, a catastrophic Series B, and a pile of investor obligations that would have taken him a decade to crawl out from under. Alistair Pemberton had appeared the way certain men do, with a solution already prepared. He'd paid off $280,000 in outstanding obligations. He'd asked for one thing in return. I had said yes because Kyle was my brother and because I hadn't seen another option. And because I had spent 5 years talking myself out of wanting something I couldn't have. And maybe part of me had decided, this is what practical looks like. This is what you choose when the thing you actually want will never be on the table. A knock. Emery, Gideon's voice, just outside the door. It's been 20 minutes. 20 minutes I hadn't noticed. Everything fits, I called back. I'll just be. Can I see it? The question landed so quietly I almost missed it. In 5 years, Gideon Ferris had never asked me anything personal, had never crossed the line we'd both kept carefully in place, the line that made it possible to work side by side for 8, 10, 12 hours at a stretch, without everything between us becoming unbearable. That's probably not, he agreed. I'm asking anyway. I opened the door. He stood in the hallway, one hand braced against the doorframe. He'd put his jacket back on at some point. His expression, when he saw me, was something I had no name for, not in any professional vocabulary I'd ever developed. He went completely still. Not the controlled stillness he used in negotiations. Something else, something that looked, for just a moment, like a man who'd stopped being careful about something very important. Well, I asked. My voice came out smaller than I intended. What do you think? He didn't answer immediately. He looked at me the way I'd felt him look at me sometimes in my peripheral vision, steady and complete, and more than I knew what to do with. Don't go with him. 3 words. I must have heard them wrong. I'm sorry? Saturday. Gideon's jaw was tight. Don't go to the Hartwell Gala with Alistair Pemberton. Mr. Ferris. Don't marry him either while we're having this conversation. He said it quietly, which somehow made it worse. Or better. I couldn't tell anymore. I stared at him. You can't just. I know. He turned away, one hand moving through his hair, a gesture I'd seen him make exactly twice before, and only under extreme pressure. I know I can't. That's not a directive. I'm not your boss right now. He stopped. Tried again. I'm telling you something I should have said before it got this far. Don't marry a man you're settling for. I'm not settling. The words tasted wrong even as I said them. You took his proposal because of Kyle's debt. He turned back to face me, and the look in his eyes made my chest hurt, in a way I didn't have a name for either. That's not a marriage, Emery. That's a transaction. How do you know about Kyle? I know everything that happens in this city. A muscle moved in his jaw, including when Alistair Pemberton pays off a struggling entrepreneur's investor obligations in exchange for his sister agreeing to an engagement. That's not generosity. That's leverage. The shame was immediate and physical, like a sudden drop in temperature. Then you understand why I can't just. I understand why you thought you couldn't. There's a difference. I shook my head. The silk of the gown caught the light and felt like a costume. Kyle would have lost everything. His apartment, his credit, years of his life trying to repay. Would have. Gideon's voice was very quiet, past tense. Something in the way he said it made me go absolutely still. What? He didn't answer, just watched me, with that steady, careful look I'd spent 5 years trying to decode. What did you do? I asked. Get changed, he said. Come find me when you're ready. I found him in his office 20 minutes later, wearing my regular clothes like armor, the garment box tucked under my arm. He was standing at the window that overlooked Boston Harbor, hands in his pockets. He didn't turn when I came in. On his desk, a folder unmarked. I opened it. The documents inside were from a holding company I didn't recognize. Harborline Capital Associates, a debt purchase agreement, Kyle's investor obligations, every last one, acquired in full. The date on the signature line was 14 months ago. 3 months before Alistair Pemberton had ever made his offer. You bought Kyle's debt. My voice didn't sound like mine. Over a year ago. His lead investor was someone I have a relationship with. When the startup started struggling, I heard about it. Gideon still hadn't turned around. I had Rigby handle it through Harborline, so it wouldn't be traced back to me. Kyle received a notice that his obligations had been acquired by a new creditor with more favorable terms. Extended timeline, reduced interest. He's been making manageable monthly payments for the past year and has no idea who actually holds the note. So when Alistair came to him with his offer, there was nothing left to save. He turned then, finally, and his expression was the most unguarded I had ever seen it. Pemberton either didn't know the debt had already been acquired, which seems unlikely given what I know about how he operates, or he knew and didn't care. Because the debt was never the point. He wanted you, Emery, the capable, sharp, well-connected daughter of a Boston family, with enough name recognition to help his campaign, but not enough power to make demands of her own. He manufactured the terms to make you feel like you had no other choice. The folder shook in my hands, and you said nothing. You'd already accepted his proposal. Because I didn't know. I know. His voice roughened. I should have told you. I didn't, because I told myself you'd made your own choice, that it wasn't my place to interfere in your personal life, which was the right reasoning and entirely the wrong decision. I've been sitting with that for 6 months. I set the folder down before I dropped it. Why are you telling me now? He crossed the room, stopping close enough that I had to look up to meet his eyes. Because you walked out of that conference room in that dress, and I thought. He stopped, exhaled, because I have spent 5 years maintaining appropriate professional distance, and I am watching you walk toward a future you deserve better than, and I am done pretending I don't have something to say about it. You have something to say after 5 years. Yes. What exactly? His throat worked. That I have been in love with you since approximately the 8-month mark, and I've handled it very poorly, and I am aware of that. The room went quiet. Outside the windows, Boston carried on, completely indifferent to the fact that the ground had just shifted under my feet. You could have said something, I finally managed. You worked for me. The words came out roughly. There is a significant power dynamic that I take seriously. I own the company, Emery. Any move I made would have put you in an impossible position, and I was not willing to do that to you. So instead you said nothing while my voice cracked slightly. I pulled it back together, while I spent years convincing myself it was all in my head. It wasn't in your head. He said it plainly, like it was the simplest thing in the world, like it hadn't just rearranged every memory I had of the last 5 years. I thought I was doing the right thing by staying quiet. I think I was wrong. I needed air. I needed to sit down. I needed him to stop looking at me like that, and I needed him to never stop looking at me like that. I have to call Alistair, I said instead. I called Alistair the next morning and asked to meet. He suggested his firm's offices in Back Bay, a 22nd floor suite that communicated exactly as much power as he intended. His assistant showed me in. There was coffee on the table I hadn't asked for. Emery. He stood when I came in, and his smile was practiced enough to pass as genuine. Alistair Pemberton was handsome in the way certain politicians are handsome, symmetrical, well-maintained, built for a camera. You sounded serious on the phone. I know about the debt, I said. No preamble, Kyle's investor obligations. I know they'd already been acquired by a third party before you ever made your offer. Something moved behind his eyes. Fast, controlled. Where did you hear that? Is it true? The smile stayed in place, but changed quality entirely. Investment debt is complex, Emery. Obligations get traded between creditors all the time. That doesn't change the fact that you let me believe my brother would be ruined if I said no to you. I kept my voice level through effort. You let me believe I was protecting my family. The whole time, his obligations were already held by someone else on terms he could actually manage. I made a genuine offer to simplify a complicated situation. You made an offer designed to make me feel like I had no other option. I held his gaze without flinching. That's what I came here to say. I'm not going to the Hartwell Gala, and I'm not marrying you. The warmth went out of his face, like a switch flipping off. You should think very carefully about this. I have. Our engagement agreement has a breach clause. He moved to the far end of the table, deliberately taking up more space. A power move he probably didn't even realize he'd learned. If you break this engagement without cause, your family is liable for reimbursement of all wedding expenses I've incurred. Venue deposit, catering contracts, the ring. He glanced at my left hand. That's roughly $60,000. And I'll be pursuing Kyle for his original investor obligations, plus compounding interest under the original punitive terms. I had expected something like this. It still landed hard. You built that clause in from the beginning, I said. I built in standard protections. He said it like it was reasonable, like it was just business. You've said you want to leave. I'm telling you the cost. I slid the ring off my finger and placed it on the conference table between us. Do what you need to do, I said. I sat in my car in the parking garage beneath his building for a long time afterward. The ring was gone from my hand. My engagement was over. Alistair was already on the phone with someone. I texted Kyle, "Call you tonight, I love you, it's going to be fine." Then I drove to Gideon's house. He lived in Brookline, a converted Victorian that had been completely rebuilt on the inside, all clean lines and warm wood, nothing like the formidable exterior suggested. The gate opened when I pulled up. I hadn't known I was on an approved list. Rigby met me at the door and showed me through, without a word, the way he did everything, efficiently, without visible opinion. Gideon was in the study, a room lined floor to ceiling with books, lit by a single standing lamp. He was still in his work clothes, like he'd come straight from the office and hadn't moved. When I appeared in the doorway, he crossed the room in 3 steps. I ended it, I said. Alistair is threatening to sue. There's a breach clause, about $60,000 in expenses, and he's saying he'll go after Kyle for the original debt under the original punitive terms. Gideon's expression went still in the particular way it did when he was deciding something. Sit down. I don't want to sit down. I want to know what we're going to do. Something shifted in his face. Surprise, maybe, at the word we. Then something warmer. The $60,000 is handled. I'll have it transferred before morning, and Pemberton won't go after Kyle. How can you know that? Because I had a conversation with him this afternoon, after you left his office. His voice was measured and completely calm. I made him aware that pursuing further legal action against you, or your brother, would be inadvisable, given certain information I have about his business practices. Information that would be deeply uncomfortable for a Senate candidate to have surface during a campaign cycle. I stared at him. You blackmailed him. I communicated relevant information and outlined consequences. A beat of silence. He'll honor the terms. I wanted to be troubled by this. I'd known for 5 years what Gideon was, what his world contained, the lines he walked, and the ones he refused to cross regardless of the cost to himself. I'd stayed anyway. I'd stayed because I'd seen how he actually operated, who he protected, who he left alone, what he wouldn't do even when it would have been far easier to do it. He wasn't good by any clean, simple definition, but he was something more complicated and more durable than simple good, and I had known that for a long time. You should have told me about Kyle's debt, I said, from the beginning. Yes, he didn't reach for an excuse. I thought I was respecting your choices. What I was actually doing was letting you make decisions with incomplete information. That was wrong, and I'm sorry. The directness of it, no hedging, no qualifications, undid something in my chest. 5 years, I said, quieter now. You waited 5 years. I told myself I was protecting you from the complications of being connected to me, from my enemies, from the nature of what I do, from a life that comes with risks most people never have to think about. His hands were still at his sides, held deliberately the way they were when he was working very hard at staying controlled. That was partly true, and almost entirely cowardice. You're not a coward. I was about this, he exhaled. Emery, Ace, the nickname, soft in his mouth, the one he used only when we were alone, only when the professional distance had worn thin after a very long day, made my throat tighten. I am telling you clearly right now, I want you here. Not as my operations manager, not as the person who keeps my professional life functional. I want you. And if that's something you could want too, I would spend every day making sure you never regretted it. It's fasts, I said, by any normal definition. We've known each other 5 years. We've worked together for 5 years. Is it different? He looked at me steadily. Because from where I'm standing, I know how you think. I know what makes you laugh. I know you take your coffee black until about 3 in the afternoon, and then you switch to tea that you forget to drink. I know you're better at reading people than you let on, and you deliberately underestimate yourself in rooms full of men who find that reassuring. I know you stayed in a job that challenged you when you had 3 other offers in the past 2 years. A pause. And I know you stayed because the work mattered and not, I hope, entirely because of the work. I hadn't known he'd known about the other offers. I stayed because of both, I admitted. He closed the remaining distance between us and took my hands in his, and the simple steadiness of it, the deliberate, unhurried steadiness, made everything inside me go quiet for the first time in months. I know what my life is, he said. I won't pretend otherwise. There are people who don't like me, people who'd use you against me if they knew you mattered to me. That's real, and you should know it going in. But Emery, I've had Rigby keeping an eye on you for 2 years already. Since a situation that got complicated before you ever knew it was happening, you've been in my world for 5 years. The danger exists whether or not I tell you how I feel. His thumbs moved across my knuckles. I'd rather face it together. I've been in love with you, I said, because there was no longer any point in waiting. For approximately 4 of the 5 years I've worked for you, I spent a lot of energy deciding it was impractical. His exhale was uneven in a way I'd never heard from him, and now, I'm done being practical about the wrong things. He kissed me once carefully, like a question he'd been holding for a very long time. I answered it. The aftermath was neither simple nor fast. Alistair held to his word. No lawsuit, no further contact. Kyle called me the night I broke the engagement, and we talked for 2 hours, and when I told him the full truth about the debt and about what Alistair had done, he was quiet for a long time, and then he said, I'm so sorry I put you in that position. I said, you didn't. He did. That distinction mattered more than I expected it to. Gideon promoted me to head of strategic operations, a title I'd been doing the work of for 2 years, which came with a compensation package that made me briefly lightheaded. He announced it in front of the entire executive floor and made clear that the promotion reflected 5 years of documented results, and that anyone who suggested otherwise should plan to have a very direct conversation with him personally. No one suggested otherwise. We took things slowly and deliberately, dinners that had nothing to do with work, long Sunday mornings along the esplanade, the patient, complicated work of learning each other outside the context that had shaped us both. He told me things I hadn't known, not about the business, but about himself, about his father, who died when Gideon was 29, and left him an empire and a mess in equal measure, about choices he'd made in the years after, which ones he stood by, and which ones he'd do differently. He didn't ask me to absolve him, he just wanted me to know who he actually was. I told him about the years before I met him, the pressure to be the responsible one, to hold everything together without complaint, to be useful enough that nobody had to worry about me, while they were busy worrying about everything else. He listened the way he did everything, completely, without waiting for his turn to speak, and then he said, "You don't have to hold everything together alone anymore. I'm not saying I'll hold it for you. I'm saying we can hold it between us." His mother, Colette, met me at a family dinner 4 months in, and regarded me with the frank assessment of a woman who'd spent decades watching people try to get close to her son for the wrong reasons. At the end of the evening, she took me aside and said, "He's been careful his whole life, too careful sometimes. I'm glad he finally wasn't." She squeezed my hand once, and that was that. Gideon asked me to marry him on an ordinary Tuesday evening, sitting at the kitchen table in his house, which had gradually, and without much ceremony, become our house. No grand gesture, no audience, just him, and a ring he'd had made by a jeweler he trusted, a sapphire surrounded by small diamonds, chosen the way he chose everything that mattered, deliberately, with full attention, and the question asked with the same quiet directness he brought to everything important. He said, "I know what I'm asking, I know what this life is, I want to build it with you if you'll let me." I said yes. At our wedding, small, immediate family, a chapel in Brookline on a gray November afternoon, Kyle walked me down the aisle, and Gideon watched me come toward him, with the same expression he'd worn in the hallway of the Ferris Group offices, the day I'd stepped out in a midnight blue gown that wasn't meant for him and asked what he thought. He had told me not to go. Standing at the altar, watching his face, the careful man finally unguarded, Finally, just Gideon. I understood that those 3 words hadn't only changed the direction of my life. They'd given it back to me. And this time, the dress I was wearing was one I had chosen for myself.